Recently, J.D. Vance was in Munich, Germany, where he criticized European leadership for heavy censorship of their citizens. Marco Rubio was on Face the Nation, where a representative of CBS equated free speech with Nazi Germany's Holocaust. This is what she said.
He was standing in a country where free speech was weaponized to conduct a genocide.
So is this true? Did Adolf Hitler weaponize free speech for him and the Nazi Party to conduct the Holocaust? Let's get into this, and let's begin with the definition of term, a word we hear a lot, fascism. And this is how it's defined just by doing a Google search. Fascism is a far-right, authoritarian, and ultra-nationalistic political ideology and movement characterized by a dictatorial leader, centralized autocracy, militarism, forcible suppression of opposition. And I think this is what really people think of when they think of fascism. Forcible suppression of opposition. When an organization says that they're anti-fascist, but then they conduct forcible suppression of opposition, you have to wonder if they really are anti-fascist, if they are acting, and as a matter of fact, per this definition of fascism. And let's get into the beginning of Adolf Hitler's rule in Germany, because there are facts that everyone should understand. And as the years go by, obviously this becomes longer and longer ago, and people tend to forget about how he rose to power. Very important to understand. But first off, let's talk about what does Nazi mean. The full name of the Nazi Party was the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And Workers' Party, that sounds communist. But they claimed to be against communism, and they had political parties that were rivals that called themselves communist. But once again, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, its members were often called Nazis. The Nazis were radical right-wing, but socialist is a left-wing ideology. That is not right. And yet when you see the definition of fascism and hear what the Nazis were, you see right-wing. I would say that's arguable. Anti-Semitic, anti-communist, although I would argue, well, both socialist and communism are leftist ideology, and I would argue that both of them lead to authoritarian regimes and anti-democratic. Now, this is very important to understand about the Nazi Party and Hitler. The Nazi Party was never a majority party in Germany, and the Germans never elected Adolf Hitler. Now, what was this Nazi Party about? What were they advertising when they were seeking popularity, when they're running against these other political parties? Well, fix the economy and put people back to work. Adolf Hitler took power in the early 30s. In 1929, the economy's destroyed. You have the Great Depression. People are out of work. Extreme poverty, people in breadlines. So, of course, that's something that's going to connect. Fix the economy and put people back to work. Return Germany to the status of a great European and even world power. They were humiliated during World War I, and they wanted that status they had before that war. They wanted to regain territory Germany had lost in World War I and create a strong authoritarian German government. Now, absolutely, they were anti-Semitic. They said that all the problems were caused by Jews and communists, and they promised to unite Germans along racial and ethnic lines and planned to exclude Jews and others from German society. Now, obviously, this is something that's horrible, excluding Jews and others from German society. But there's a big difference between that and saying you're going to grab people, you're going to get people together, and you're going to slaughter them. You're going to murder them. So a big difference. Now let's look at the series of events. So here we have a timeline. January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany. Once again, never elected by the German people. And what is the first thing he does? What is the very first thing he does? Issues emergency decrees that mark the end of all basic freedoms. including freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, and protection from arbitrary arrest. You can be arrested any time for any reason. First thing he does is he gets rid of free speech. And then what does he do? He becomes a dictator, empowers Hitler to establish a dictatorship in Germany. Now, did Germans speak out against this? No, they couldn't, because they no longer had freedom of speech. What's the next thing that happens? A one-day boycott against Jewish businesses in Germany, and then you start to exclude Jews and political opponents from government, from university positions, Jews that are lawyers, judges, doctors, teachers. You start to exclude them from your society. Now we go to 1935. More of Jews losing their rights, prohibiting marriage and sexual relationships between Germans and Jews, and state that only persons of Germans or related blood can be citizens. 1938, April 26. So we're talking about over 5 years of Germany not having freedom of speech. Jews forced to register their assets, a step towards total exclusion from German society. Jewish doctors forbidden to treat German patients. Jews whose names do not clearly identify them as being Jewish are required to add Israel and Sarah to passport and identification papers. Jews forced to give up their passports for passports that clearly identified them as being Jewish. Continuing, 1938, a wave of state-organized attacks targeting Jewish business. Now, were there Germans that spoke out against this? Well, they couldn't. Once again, no freedom of speech. Ministry of Education expels all Jewish children from public schools. Ministry restricts the freedom of movement of Jews. Then we move on. 1939, they take Poland. In occupied Poland, Jews aged 10 and older are forced to wear a yellow star or armband identifying them as Jewish. May 20th, 1940, over 7 years of Germany not having freedom of speech. The Auschwitz concentration camp opens in occupied Poland. It will eventually become a mixed camp, concentration and death camp, where nearly 1 million Jews are murdered. And then we have the mass murdering of the Jewish people. So, the idea that Hitler and the Nazi Party weaponized free speech to enact the Holocaust is a lie. I've heard people say that CBS did this out of ignorance. I do not believe that is the case. I believe what they did was the continuous molestation of Western values, the continuous, intentional, corrupting, redefining of Western values. Now, why would they do that? I believe it's because you have a global ruling class that doesn't want the people of a nation to be united and strong. They want the people of a nation, especially the United States, to be divided and weak, because that makes them much easier to rule. I believe that is the intent. I don't believe this was out of ignorance. I believe what they did was evil, and Marco Rubio had an excellent response, a better response that I would have given. I would have probably just spotted out cuss words, probably given the middle finger after somebody would say something like that. Marco Rubio did a much better job than I would have. Here was his response.
And you know that the censorship was specifically about the right.
No, I have to disagree with you. Free speech was not used to conduct a genocide. The genocide was conducted by an authoritarian Nazi regime that happened to also be genocidal because they hated Jews and they hated minorities and they hated those that they had a list of people they hated, but primarily the Jews. There was no free speech in Nazi Germany. There was none. There was also no opposition in Nazi Germany. They were a sole and only party that governed that country. So that's not an accurate reflection of history. I also think it's wrong. Again, I go back to the point of his speech. Okay, the point of his speech was basically that there is an erosion in free speech and intolerance for opposing points of view within Europe, and that's of concern because that is eroding. That's not an erosion of your military capabilities. That's not an erosion of your economic standing. That's an erosion of the actual values that bind us together in this transatlantic union that everybody talks about. And I think allies and friends and partners that have worked together now for 80 years should be able to speak frankly to one another in open forums. Without being offended, insulted, or upset. And I spoke to foreign ministers from multiple countries throughout Europe. Many of them probably didn't like the speech or didn't agree with it, but they were continuing to engage with us on all sorts of issues that unite us. So again, at the end of the day, I think that people give that is a forum in which you're supposed to be inviting people to give speeches, not basically a chorus where everyone is saying the exact same thing. That's not always going to be the case when it's a collection of democracies where leaders have the right and the privilege to speak their minds in forums such as these.
Mr. Secretary, I'm told that we are out of time. A lot to get through with you. We appreciate you making time today.
Yeah.